November 11, 1940. The proving grounds at Camp Holabird, Maryland, were cold and silent except for the sound of engines. A small, box-shaped vehicle rolled through the mud. It had no roof, no doors, and looked unfinished. Its body rattled, its tires cut deep lines in the frozen soil, and its frame shook over uneven ground. Officers watched from the edge of the field, coats buttoned tight. Someone in the back whispered, "That thing won't last a month." The vehicle was not built by an automobile giant. It came from a tiny Pennsylvania firm, the Bantam Car Company, working on a desperate government contract for a light reconnaissance vehicle. The Army had issued the request in July, 1,300 pounds, four-wheel drive, and a 40-horsepower engine. They gave companies 49 days to design, build, and deliver a prototype. Only Bantam had responded in time. Their engineers worked in a rented garage, sleeping on the floor between shifts. The first prototype, the BRC-40, arrived at Holabird 2 days before the deadline, towed behind a civilian truck because it was still untested. According to Army test reports, the Bantam prototype passed every terrain trial but failed to convince the Ordnance observers. They called it too light for sustained field duty. American engineers from larger firms, Willys-Overland and Ford, examined it and laughed. It looked like a toy, with flat panels and a fragile wheelbase. The Army invited both to produce modified versions. Within months, 3 nearly identical machines stood side by side at Holabird, Bantam's BRC, Willys' Quad, and Ford's GP. Each followed the same blueprint, each weighed more than the last, and each was painted in olive drab with the white star of the U.S. Army. Film reels from the test show the vehicles bouncing over trenches, fording rivers, and climbing inclines at impossible angles. Drivers in heavy coats gripped thin steering wheels as mud splashed against the camera lens. Mechanics recorded torque figures. Officers scribbled notes. The reports used measured language: maneuverability excellent, ground clearance sufficient, engine power marginal. Yet behind those phrases, something new was forming, a mobile platform that could go anywhere an infantryman could walk. By early 1941, the War Department authorized a production order. Willys secured the contract with its stronger 60-horsepower Go Devil engine. Ford received a secondary contract to build the same design under the code GPW. The vehicles were nearly identical, only the engine plates differed. In factory terms, they were simple, flat steel panels, open chassis, and no luxury components. A single worker could bolt one together in under a day. In warehouses across Toledo and Dearborn, crates of steel arrived every morning. Men with pneumatic riveters lined the frames, attaching fenders, seats, and axles with industrial precision. On the floor, thousands of identical parts lay sorted in bins, gears, shafts, and canvas tops. The Willys plant's production logs from June 1941 recorded an output of 45 vehicles per day. By the following spring, that number had tripled. Outside the factory gates, early production units stood in neat rows awaiting transport. Each carried a shovel, a spare wheel, and a folded windshield. Soldiers called them jeeps, a slang term for new recruits or test vehicles. The name stuck. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Jeep had already become a standard-issue item. According to the War Production Board, its cost was roughly $739 per unit, 1/20th the price of a tank. It could be lifted by 6 men, driven through a stream, or loaded into a glider. In a war defined by speed and logistics, those numbers mattered more than armor or guns. The camera pans from the production lines to the testing ground, rows of small olive machines idling under grey winter light. Engines ticking, exhaust visible in the cold air. Officers stand silent, hands in pockets, watching the vehicles climb a muddy hill. In that moment, the laughter has stopped. The machine that looked like a joke is now an instrument of war. By the summer of 1941, the first convoys of Willys MBS left the American coast under the Lend-Lease program. Crated and stowed among tanks and munitions, they were shipped to Britain and the Soviet Union. Each vehicle arrived disassembled, frame, axles, engine, and body panels packed like machine parts. British engineers at the Motor Industry Research Association reassembled the first test batch on an overcast morning in Coventry. One officer described it in a field note, "Crude, but works. Does not stop." In England, the Jeep's design seemed absurdly simple compared to British staff cars or scout vehicles. Its panels were flat because they could be stamped without molds. Its fenders were squared to prevent mud build-up. The seats were canvas stretched over tubing. Yet the simplicity meant speed. A damaged Jeep could be rebuilt in an hour with a wrench and a hammer. Mechanics soon discovered they could strip the entire drivetrain in less time than it took to boil tea. At the same moment, U.S. Army observers were testing the same vehicle in Louisiana maneuvers. Footage from the Army Pictorial Service shows columns of Jeeps splashing through flooded roads, headlights covered in blackout shades. The engine note, a dry mechanical rhythm, remained constant even as they climbed steep embankments. In the film, one can see mud streaks across the side panels, soldiers standing on running boards shouting to nearby units. According to the 1st Armored Division's field report from September 1941, the Jeep outperformed every tracked light vehicle in endurance tests. It crossed 35 miles of swamp terrain without mechanical failure. Water reached the bottom of the engine block, yet the ignition held. In the same report, an officer wrote, "Unfit for parade, indispensable for movement." When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the Jeep was already on every continent. Willys and Ford plants ran around the clock. By 1942, one rolled off the line every 80 seconds. The War Production Board classified it as truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4. Soldiers simply called it the Jeep. In North Africa, the first field reports arrived from the 1st Infantry Division. The desert heat warped carburetors and softened tires, but the Jeeps kept moving. Photographs from the Iran and El Gheta sectors show them pulling anti-tank guns, ferrying water cans, and carrying stretchers. The same vehicle served as an ambulance, command post, and radio car. One was modified with twin machine guns mounted on a steel frame, creating the first improvised desert raider. The German Afrika Korps observed the new vehicle with curiosity. In captured correspondence, a German officer referred to it as the small American machine that goes anywhere. Reports from Panzerarmee Afrika noted its ability to appear unexpectedly behind lines. Its light weight allowed soldiers to lift it over trenches or push it up dunes when engines failed. No comparable vehicle existed in German service at that time. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Jeep convoys arrived under Arctic conditions. Soviet mechanics adapted the carburetors for low temperatures and replaced oils with winter-grade lubricants. At Murmansk, American engineers filmed a Willys starting at -30 degrees Celsius without external heat. Soviet crews nicknamed it the Little Mule. According to Lend-Lease inventory records, over 50,000 Jeeps were delivered to the Red Army by 1945. The design evolved only slightly. Willys standardized the grille into 9 vertical slots, pressed from a single steel sheet instead of welded bars. This saved £10 per vehicle and reduced assembly time. The headlights were recessed to protect against damage. Canvas tops were redesigned to fold within seconds. Each improvement came from field feedback, not corporate design meetings. At night, desert camps glowed with the faint light of maintenance lamps. Mechanics worked with tools clinking against steel. Jeeps stood in rows, hoods up, engines ticking as fuel lines were cleared. Every sound in those workshops became part of a larger rhythm of war production, constant, efficient, and mechanical. In less than a year, the vehicle that had once drawn laughter became the backbone of Allied mobility. It could scout terrain before tanks arrived, transport wounded soldiers away from fire, or serve as a command post with a radio bolted to its floor. It was neither armored nor fast, yet it never stopped. The soldiers trusted it because it behaved like they did, resourceful, dirty, and reliable. By mid-1942, Willys-Overland's Toledo plant ran under full wartime blackout conditions. Rows of ceiling lamps cast a narrow, amber light across steel frames. Conveyor belts moved in rhythm, each carrying a chassis stripped of paint and glistening with primer oil. The production floor sounded like a metronome, presses thudding, drills cutting, rivets snapping into place. Official War Production Board documents show that by September, combined Jeep output from Willys and Ford had reached 5,000 units per week, a figure unmatched by any other motorized platform. Each Jeep required fewer than 1,200 individual parts, compared to more than 25,000 for a Sherman tank. The component list fit on a single sheet. No specialized alloys, no cast armor. This minimalism was deliberate. Parts were standardized so completely that a Ford-made differential could fit a Willys frame without modification. Supply officers noted that repair depots could service any Jeep using mixed crates of spares. What began as a manufacturing compromise became the first large-scale example of universal interchangeability in mobile warfare. According to internal memoranda from the Quartermaster Corps, the vehicle's logistics efficiency altered how field divisions were structured. A battalion that once required 80 motorcycles and 10 light trucks could now operate with 50 Jeeps, each carrying a driver, a gunner, and supplies. Fuel consumption averaged 25 miles per gallon, compared to 8 for tracked vehicles. The numbers spoke for themselves. A single tanker truck of gasoline could keep an entire reconnaissance company moving for days. In late 1942, the Office of Statistical Control began aggregating data from every production plant. The results were striking. At its peak, one Jeep was produced every 75 seconds. The total exceeded 640,000 units by the end of 1945. For comparison, all American tank production, light, medium, and heavy, amounted to roughly 90,000. The Jeep had outsold every armored vehicle combined. The War Department's reports detail its transformation beyond transportation. Engineers at field workshops adapted the frame for over 100 specialized roles. Photographs from the Signal Corps show Jeeps carrying .50 caliber mounts, cable reels, stretchers, searchlights, and even small rocket pods. In Burma, British Chindits modified them with radio beacons for air supply drops. In Italy, medics fitted 2 stretchers above the rear wheels, turning each into a compact ambulance. The same vehicle design served in every theater, climate, and branch. Factory data from Ford's Rouge plant reveals an equally precise rhythm. Each assembly line segment took 23 minutes to complete. Welders joined the chassis, inspectors tapped bolts with mallets to check torque. Women workers installed wiring harnesses along the firewall, a practice borrowed from aircraft production. Photographers captured them standing over open frames, sleeves rolled high, faces expressionless under fluorescent light. It was not invention that made the Jeep remarkable, it was reproducibility. According to the Lend-Lease Statistical Summary of 1944, 181,000 Jeeps were sent overseas. 51,000 went to Britain, 50,000 to the USSR, 31,000 to France, and the rest distributed across the Commonwealth. The figures underline how one American vehicle became multinational without redesign. No other wartime machine achieved that level of standardization. A notable entry from a 1943 British Ministry of Supply memo described the Jeep's adaptability. It has no personality. which is precisely its virtue. It becomes whatever the soldier requires. That assessment was not poetic, it was logistical. The same chassis accepted any field modification because it was designed with excess tolerance, slightly looser fittings, thicker bolts, and symmetrical frame geometry. In engineering terms, imperfection became advantage. Back in the US, training films produced for the Army Service Forces documented these lessons in neutral tones. One reel, Maintenance of the Quarter-Ton Truck, instructed soldiers to check the transfer case after every 100 miles. The narration noted, "This vehicle will endure more than its driver." On screen, hands cleaned spark plugs, adjusted timing, and closed the hood with a metallic click. No music. Just the sound of discipline and design. By late 1943, the statistics no longer described an experiment. They described an ecosystem, factories, depots, convoys, and repair shops synchronized through one machine. Production records from the Office of War Information listed total man-hours per Jeep at just under 110. Tanks required over 2,000. In the arithmetic of war, the Jeep's simplicity multiplied power. When engineers compared the cost curves, the realization was clear: mobility had become cheaper than firepower. Every tank division now depended on the small, open-framed vehicle once dismissed as a novelty. August 1945. The war ended with factories still running. In Toledo, the Willys assembly line stood in partial silence. Rows of completed vehicles waited for shipping orders that would never come. The war had consumed nearly everything: steel, fuel, and men, yet one small machine had outlasted every expectation. According to final War Department inventories, 647,870 Jeeps had been produced by VJ Day. The number was higher than the total of all tanks, armored cars, and half-tracks combined. Declassified correspondence from the Office of Strategic Services described the Jeep as the universal transport. Intelligence officers used them in France, Norway, and the Philippines. In post-war Europe, the same vehicles now carried displaced civilians, engineers, and medical teams. Many had bullet holes patched with riveted steel or wooden panels. Their olive paint was faded, canvas torn, but the engine still started on the first turn. In a continent of wrecked bridges and mined roads, they remained the only vehicles that could move freely. Photographs from the ruins of Berlin show American MPs directing traffic from Jeeps parked beside collapsed buildings. British occupation forces in Hamburg converted several into mobile radio posts. In Italy, farmers used them to pull carts through destroyed fields. Even stripped of insignia, the silhouette was unmistakable: flat hood, upright grille, short wheelbase. It had become the outline of mobility itself. According to 1946 export data, Willys began converting wartime stock into civilian models labeled CJ, Civilian Jeep. The first advertisements avoided any mention of war. Instead, they showed a man in overalls driving across a field, the tagline reading, "The sun never sets on the Willys." But the design was unchanged. The same 60-horsepower engine, the same 3-speed gearbox, the same reinforced frame built for campaign roads. The U.S. Bureau of Public Roads conducted a study that year comparing the Jeep's mechanical endurance with that of light trucks. The report concluded, average service life exceeds all comparable platforms under continuous load. In other words, the machine built for invasion had quietly become the standard for reconstruction. The simplicity that once drew laughter from engineers now defined the post-war utility vehicle industry. At military surplus depots, thousands of Jeeps were sold to civilians for as little as $50. Farmers, miners, and engineers drove them into new terrain, mountains, deserts, and jungles. By 1947, survey photographs from Brazil, Burma, and Alaska all showed the same shape moving through mud, sand, and snow. It was no longer an American design, it was a tool for anyone who needed to move through chaos. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department published its final wartime evaluation in 1948. The report stated, the 1/4-ton truck proved the principle of mechanical sufficiency. Nothing larger can do more with less. The tone was technical, not sentimental. Yet within that sentence was the quiet recognition of what had changed. The Jeep had not just moved soldiers, it had redefined what efficiency meant. In a post-war interview, Willys engineer Delmar Barney Vroos was asked whether the Jeep's success was intentional. He replied, "We didn't design it to last. We designed it not to stop." His words matched the vehicle's character: practical, unsentimental, absolute. By the end of the decade, nations from France to Japan were producing their own versions. Mitsubishi, Hotchkiss, and Land Rover all began as licensed or inspired designs. Each carried the same logic: simplicity over sophistication. That lineage continued into every modern light utility vehicle that followed. On surviving wartime footage, a column of Jeeps moves slowly down a muddy road somewhere in Europe. Engines hum evenly, tires cutting into wet soil. Soldiers sit in silence, faces turned toward a horizon not yet rebuilt. The camera pans upward, grey sky, low clouds, endless road. The machine that once made engineers laugh had become the template for movement itself. Its story ended not with a weapon's triumph but with a design that refused to break. By 1950, the Jeep's wartime reputation had already turned into doctrine. Military training manuals from Fort Benning listed the vehicle not as a light transport but as terrain equalizer. The phrase described its tactical role, the ability to erase the limits of geography. Wherever tanks could not go are mountains, jungle, or rubble, a Jeep could. In Korea, that rule proved absolute. Archival combat footage from the Pusan perimeter in 1950 shows Jeeps hauling ammunition through riverbeds under fire. They ferried wounded men to evacuation points, headlights covered with blackout shades. The 7th Infantry Division reported that some Jeeps logged over 10,000 miles of frontline use without major failure. Engineers noted that the cold affected the drivers before it affected the engines. Back in the United States, Willys engineers studied the return vehicles. Axles bent, gearboxes cracked, but the core design remained functional. According to maintenance summaries from the Ordnance Corps, over 85% of battle-damaged Jeeps were repairable in the field. That level of recoverability was unheard of in military vehicle design. Even tanks with partial damage were often scrapped. The Jeep simply refused to die. The design began to evolve in parallel with global reconstruction. In Japan, the Mitsubishi license produced the first local Jeep variants under U.S. occupation contracts. In France, Hotchkiss factories built M201S for NATO service. In Britain, the Land Rover appeared in 1948, nearly identical in frame geometry and mechanical philosophy. Engineers in Solihull admitted the influence openly. The British version was a Jeep made for peace. Civilian demand expanded faster than any forecast. Willys could no longer meet orders from agriculture, construction, and exploration sectors. Logging companies used them to tow timber. Oil prospectors mounted drilling rigs on their beds. The U.S. Forest Service converted fleets into fire patrol vehicles. By 1952, a Jeep could be found on every inhabited continent. Economic data from the Department of Commerce confirms the scale. Between 1946 and 1955, over 400,000 civilian Jeeps were sold worldwide, more than the total production of all pre-war American cars exported in the 1930s. The global mobility industry was no longer defined by luxury or power but by reliability under neglect. In the automotive press, engineers debated its aesthetics. Some called it ugly, others called it pure. But none disputed its logic. The rectangular frame allowed straight-line manufacturing, reducing material waste. The wheel arches were symmetrical to ease stamping. The seats, removable. The windshield, folding. Every part obeyed a single law, function before form. The visual result became its identity, a design language built entirely from purpose. A 1954 Popular Mechanics feature titled "The Vehicle That Wouldn't Quit" summarized the paradox. It was built as temporary equipment and became permanent culture. Photographs showed farmers, hunters, and surveyors using the same olive vehicles once driven across Africa. The war machine had become a civilian companion. By the early 1960s, the Jeep's descendants had expanded into entirely new categories. The M38A1 introduced a rounded hood and stronger frame, while the civilian CJ05 brought comfort features, side doors, heaters, and improved suspension, without changing its essential shape. Through each iteration, the dimensions of the 1941 design remained visible. Military assessments continued to cite its influence. A 1963 Pentagon logistics report noted, "The modern concept of tactical mobility derives directly from the 1/4-ton truck design of 1940. That sentence closed a circle. The machine that once seemed too simple had reshaped global doctrine, mobility as strategy, not by speed or armor, but by presence. In design archives, a recurring line appears in every analysis: simplicity equals survival. It was not a slogan but an engineering principle proven in mud, sand, and snow. From Normandy to Incan, from Burma to the Alps, that principle held. Footage from an army training film in 1965 shows recruits learning maintenance on a Jeep older than they were. The instructor points to the carburetor, then the ignition coil. "Understand the pattern," he says. "Everything connects." The camera lingers on the open hood, the exposed metal, the sound of an idling engine. 25 years after its first test, the machine still runs as it did, unrefined, reliable, alive. The Jeep's laughter-born origin had become an unspoken law of engineering. Not every breakthrough is elegant. Not every innovation begins with faith. Sometimes, endurance itself becomes the design. By 1965, the word Jeep no longer referred only to a vehicle. It had entered engineering language as a concept, shorthand for utility achieved through reduction. Military engineers studying Vietnam-era terrain cited the Jeep as the baseline for tactical movement. Even as larger vehicles like the M151 MUT replaced it, the original logic remained: minimal parts, maximum adaptability. Footage from Pleiku and Da Nang shows later models crossing flooded paddies, their exhausts bubbling through brown water. The soldiers driving them were young enough to have never seen the Second World War, but they used the same mechanical grammar. Steering by instinct, fixing by feel. The sound of the small four-cylinder engine echoed across a new kind of battlefield. In industrial America, that simplicity began to influence an entirely different field: manufacturing design. Wartime engineers who had produced Jeeps in Toledo and Dearborn now led post-war industries in appliances, tools, and aviation components. They carried with them a principle proven under pressure: every part must justify its presence. By the late 1960s, this thinking formed the foundation of modular production lines and interchangeable sub-assemblies, the architecture behind modern industrial efficiency. Willys itself evolved through mergers and acquisitions, yet the core product remained. Kaiser Jeep, then American Motors, carried the design forward. The 1970 CJ5 and CJ7 bore new paint, new tires, and new marketing, but their dimensions trace directly back to 1941. Engineers did not redesign the Jeep, they calibrated it. Each curve and bracket was a refinement of survival data gathered in war. The pattern spread globally. In Japan, Toyota's Land Cruiser adopted the same narrow wheelbase and four-wheel drive layout, refined for mountainous terrain. In Britain, Land Rover Series 2 kept the flat panels and riveted aluminum body. Both companies acknowledged their debt to the American original. The post-war map of engineering lineage could be traced not through patents but through geometry, rectangles, symmetry, bolts, and straight edges. The Jeep's underlying idea even reached aerospace. During the Apollo program, NASA engineers studied the Jeep suspension system while designing the Lunar roving vehicle. Internal memos from the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston cite 1/4-ton mechanical simplicity as a model for extraterrestrial ground vehicles. The lunar rover that rolled across the moon in 1971 shared the same philosophy: a light frame, large tires, minimal moving parts, and guaranteed repairability in the field. In corporate records from the 1980s, when Jeep production moved under Chrysler, marketing teams debated whether to modernize the design. Focus groups wanted comfort, engineers argued for clarity. The engineers prevailed. Even as the Jeep Wrangler replaced the CJ line in 1986, the flat hood and vertical grille stayed untouched, a quiet act of continuity through decades of industrial change. Meanwhile, historians began to quantify its cultural reach. The Smithsonian's 1989 Machines That Changed America exhibit displayed a Willys MB beside a Model T and a DC-3. The curators described it as the purest form of American mechanical expression. Yet the artifact's value lay not in national pride but in universality. A machine that could be built anywhere, fixed anywhere, and understood by anyone. By the late 20th century, the Jeep had become both relic and blueprint. Its DNA appeared in every SUV, pickup, and off-road vehicle produced worldwide. Beyond the automotive field, its influence reached software and system design. Engineers used the term Jeep logic to describe programs that worked under imperfect conditions with minimal failure points. An internal Chrysler engineering manual from 1994 stated it plainly: a Jeep is not designed for ideal circumstances, it is designed for when everything else stops. That sentence mirrored the first Bantam blueprint drawn more than half a century earlier. Archival film closes with a familiar image, an original 1941 Willys MB starting on a museum floor. The starter whines, the engine catches, and the idle settles into a steady mechanical pulse. No computers, no insulation, no refinement, just a small machine performing the one act it was built to do. In that sound, every era of engineering finds its reminder. True innovation is not always a breakthrough, sometimes it is endurance perfected. The machine that once drew laughter became the lesson every designer eventually learns, that simplicity, under pressure, is not weakness but mastery. In post-war America, machines became symbols of progress: faster, larger, more complex. Jet aircraft crossed oceans, televisions filled living rooms, and assembly lines stretched farther than any road. Yet beneath that tide of advancement, a single wartime invention continued to whisper an opposite idea, that perfection comes not from addition, but from subtraction. The Jeep embodied that paradox. Soldiers who had driven it across continents remembered it not as a machine, but as a companion. It was one of the few wartime devices that seemed to understand them, mechanical yet human in scale, stubborn yet honest. You could see every part it used. You could touch every system it depended on. In an age of growing complexity, the Jeep became a form of mechanical truth. Psychologists studying veterans during the late 1940s noted an unusual attachment to the vehicle. Men who showed little sentiment toward their weapons described their Jeep with precision and care. One veteran told an interview from the Veterans Administration in 1947, "I didn't trust much over there, but I trusted that engine." The comment was not romantic, it was factual. The machine had proven itself in silence, without promises. Design historians later called this effect mechanical empathy, the tendency to project reliability onto simple objects whose function could be fully grasped. The Jeep made people believe in machines again, not as unknowable systems, but as extensions of human endurance. In the psychological recovery of the post-war years, that mattered more than its horsepower or range. Industrial designers across disciplines began to internalize the lesson. Raymond Loewy, famed for streamlining American appliances, once remarked, "The Jeep has no design. That is why it is perfect." His comment, recorded in a 1952 lecture at the Cooper Union, became a turning point in post-war design education. The new aesthetic standard was clarity, every line visible, every function apparent. In museums and classrooms, the Jeep became a teaching object. Engineering students measured its tolerances, noting how looseness prevented seizing in sand and cold. Product designers studied its proportions, low center of gravity, balanced axle distance, minimal ornamentation. It became a case study not only in mechanics but in psychology, a reminder that confidence in technology begins when the user feels control. That principle resurfaced decades later in unexpected forms. Early personal computers adopted modular components and removable panels for the same reason: transparency breeds trust. Software engineers invoked Jeep logic when writing fail-safe systems: simple, redundant, repairable. The philosophy extended into aviation, robotics, and even medicine. The idea that the most resilient designs are those most easily understood became an unspoken standard of modern engineering. For those who had once laughed at the first prototype, history delivered its quiet correction. The Bantam engineers in that Pennsylvania garage had not built a masterpiece of precision, they had built a masterpiece of faith, faith that a good idea could survive neglect, misuse, and time. The proof was still running on four wheels half a century later. Archival sound captures it best: the crank of an ignition, the dry hum of the Go Devil engine, and the low idle that follows. That sound reached across generations, from the soldiers who relied on it in Tunisia to the farmers who rebuilt with it in Kansas. The noise of survival. As the 20th century closed, the Jeep had become invisible not because it disappeared, but because its logic had spread everywhere. Every device designed to work in silence, under pressure, owes something to that small, open-framed vehicle. It taught an industrial world chasing perfection that the truest measure of progress is not complexity, but endurance. The final image is timeless: a lone Jeep on a dirt road, its paint faded, its tires worn, its engine still running steady. No music, no words. Just the quiet rhythm of a machine that never asked to be remembered, and was remembered because it never stopped working. In 2025, one of the last surviving Willys MBS from the North African campaign stands inside a climate-controlled hangar at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum, Fort Eustis, Virginia. The paint has dulled to a matte green. Its canvas top is frayed and patched with field stitching. On the dashboard, a small brass plate reads Truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4, Willys-Overland Motors, 1942. When the curator turns the key, the engine still starts. The sound is rough at first, then steady, an echo carried forward 83 years. Archival photographs show that same vehicle crossing Tunisia in 1943, its windshield folded down, a jerrycan strapped to the rear. The driver's name, stenciled faintly on the hood, is still visible under the layers of varnish. Between those two images, one taken in war, one in preservation, lies the entire journey of 20th century engineering. Records from the National Archives describe how the final wartime production run ended on August 20, 1945. The last Jeep rolled off the Toledo line under a banner that read, "Let's bring them home." The workers who built it had no idea that their design would outlive them. Over the decades, more than 100 countries adopted variations: Brazil's Ford Rural, India's Mahindra CJ, Japan's Mitsubishi J-Series. Each carried the same mechanical signature, a square body on 4 narrow wheels, a single-purpose engine, and the will to keep moving. Humanitarian agencies soon learned what armies had discovered. The Red Cross used jeeps to deliver vaccines across Burma and Ethiopia. The United Nations operated them during early peacekeeping missions in Cyprus and the Congo. Their design needed no manual translation, any mechanic could repair them with wire, a wrench, and patience. A wartime artifact had become a global constant, a moving piece of infrastructure that required no permission to function. Military procurement documents from the 1960s through the 1990s reveal an unbroken procurement chain. Each new generation of light utility vehicles referenced the 1940 Willys MB as standard form factor. Even when electronics replaced carburetors and alloys replaced steel, the outline remained the same. The Jeep's geometry had become part of institutional memory, the measure by which practicality itself was judged. At restoration workshops today, veterans and engineers work side by side. They document serial numbers, clean carburetors, and replace rusted bolts with precision. The restoration process is quiet, almost reverent. Each restored engine becomes a bridge between those who built, drove, and studied them. One curator described it as restoring the sound of reason. Outside the museum circuit, thousands of original Jeeps still operate, on farms in India, in the Andes, in rural Australia. Some have been converted to diesel, others still use the original Willys 4-cylinder. They carry timber, grain, or children to school. Their survival is not nostalgia, it is evidence. Machines built for emergency have found permanence because they never required perfection. The engineering notes of Karl Probst, the Bantam designer who first drafted the 1940 prototype, remain preserved in the U.S. Library of Congress. His handwriting is small and uneven. On the first page, one line stands alone, "Keep it simple enough for any soldier to fix." 8 words that shaped 8 decades of machinery. In the final archival reel, filmed by the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1945, a convoy of jeeps drives into a setting sun on a dirt airfield in France. The camera pans slowly. Dust rises behind them and hangs in the air, glowing in the low light. No narrator speaks. The film ends with silence, a silence that carries everything the numbers never could, the sound of endurance, the rhythm of motion, the measure of simplicity. From the Bantam garage in Pennsylvania to the modern 4-wheel drives of today, the line has never broken. It continues through every device designed to work, to last, and to serve. The laughter that once greeted the first Jeep has long faded. What remains is the quiet proof of a principle that outlived its century, that a tool built for survival becomes a legacy when it asks for nothing but to keep going.